we want a strategy like the Own the Podium for agriculture. And so that means that we've got to do some work as a sector, as an industry, to get our thinking aligned and make sure that it's understandable. But what we want from government is a move away from this sort of piecemeal approach and to have a really whole of government, I know that's a very Ottawa term, but a whole of government approach where all the government departments that are involved in any way with agriculture have a collective mandate to really move the sector forward.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm your host, Erin. As Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada, I started this podcast to serve as a forum for real conversations with industry influencers and policymakers. Today's conversation is all about how Canadian agriculture can own the podium in 2021 and beyond. We will explore what that means and what it will take for agriculture to rebound and thrive as a sector in a post-pandemic world. Joining us today is Pierre Petelle. Pierre is the President and Chief Executive Officer of CropLife Canada. CropLife Canada is a trade association that represents Canadian manufacturers, developers, and distributors of pest control products and plants with novel traits. Pierre, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Erin. Thanks for the opportunity.
Never before in my lifetime have Canadians spent more time talking about where our food comes from. We've heard even more about this now over the last few months, largely due to the pandemic. I know that CropLife has conducted significant research in this space, tracking how Canadian consumers perceive our sector and what influences those perceptions. What impact, if any, do you think the pandemic has had on the Canadian conversation around food?
Well, yeah, thanks, Erin. I think for the first time, consumers in Canada saw, even if they were only short-lived, they saw shortages of certain products on their grocery shelves for the first time in their lifetimes. And I think it hit home to them that, wow, there's actually a whole agriculture system behind this and a supply chain, and there can be potential impacts of things like a pandemic. And so I think for the first time, people are starting to wonder and talk about where that food comes from. And I think this is an opportunity for us. We know that the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, who does extensive polling every year, they show that 93% of people know little or nothing about farming, and that a good 2/3 of them want to know more, and they want to know more about how their food is made and where it comes from. So we think this is a great opportunity, actually. As negative as this crisis is, I think agriculture is poised to really tell its story, and your members in particular have the story that people want to hear. They want to know about how farmers are growing their food, how they're doing it sustainably and protecting the land, and it's a great opportunity to really tell that story.
And you've been having that conversation lately in leadership circles about what it's going to take to ensure that our sector is poised to contribute to the post-pandemic recovery. Some economic reports released by the government, as we well know in recent years, suggest that the sector has yet to reach its full potential. You recently used the word or the term "own the podium," and this is to capture what our sector is striving for. I think most Canadians will remember this expression from the 2010 Olympics, but can you tell me how this concept can be applied to Canadian agriculture?
Yeah, so, and again, I probably stole that moniker from someone else, but I think it really resonates with where we are today. That description, "own the podium," everyone will recall, was when Canada hosted the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. And the previous two Olympics in Canada, in 76 in Montreal and 98 in Calgary, Canada failed to win a single gold medal in either one of those Olympics. And so this strategy was developed to really invest and put Canadian athletes at the forefront and give them everything they needed to succeed. And the result is that we didn't achieve the top medal win, but we won the most gold medals of any other country, and it was the first time in 50 years that the host country had done that. And so it was a huge success. And what the reason we use that term is that when we talk about agricultural innovation, whether it's regulatory reform, which I'm sure we'll touch on, it's done sort of piecemeal. You work with this department on this issue, and another group works on another department on that issue. There hasn't been sort of a government-wide concerted effort to really help agriculture reach its potential. And so what we're saying is that we want a strategy like the Own the Podium for agriculture. And so that means that we've got to do some work as a sector, as an industry, to get our thinking aligned and make sure that it's understandable. But what we want from government is a move away from this sort of piecemeal approach and to have a really whole of government, I know that's a very Ottawa term, but a whole of government approach where all the government departments that are involved in any way with agriculture have a collective mandate to really move the sector forward. And, when I look at our member companies, Canada is not the biggest market for these products, for pesticides or innovative seeds. But it's a market where farmers are quick to adopt. And we've seen tremendous success in the adoption of all the latest technologies, all the latest seed varieties. Canadian farmers, your members, they want those new techniques and new technologies, and they're quick to adopt them. So our members are poised to bring those and continue to bring them to Canada. But we need a business market and an business environment that is attractive and predictable and has timely decisions out of the regulatory system. And so there's a lot of work to be done in some of those areas, and just to make sure that Canada doesn't fall behind its competitors. We've seen that. For example, the voice of farmers with government is critically important, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about our digital advocacy initiative to really give farmers that voice to be right into Ottawa.
Thanks, Pierre. So you've identified a few different stakeholders there, and I want to unpack that a little and get into some specifics if we can. The role of government, the role of industry, your members in particular, and the role that my members, that farmers across the country can play in this. Are there any existing forums through which some of these goals could be accomplished?
Certainly with government, we regulatory improvement is nothing new, and we've seen a number of different initiatives. The government formed economic advisory tables last year, or a couple of years ago now, and the agriculture one came up with a series of recommendations, and regulatory improvements was one that was identified as a key priority. We also saw the Canadian Chamber of Commerce release a report, Death by 130,000 Cuts, and it was really highlighting the regulatory burden that Canadian businesses are under. And we participated in that, and there's a number of examples in that report that highlight, specific to the ag sector, what some of those burdens are. And so there's already been a lot of work done and identified areas that are ripe for improvement. What we need now is that sort of push and the momentum to really make it a priority. And coming out of the COVID crisis, we know that governments around the world are going to be looking for economic successes to help them dig out of this hole that we're going to be in. And we think that agriculture is a great industry, and some of these reports in the past have really highlighted the potential there. And so we'd like this government to really take a look at how they can position Canadian agriculture to really help the whole Canadian economy after this crisis. In terms of farmers, I touched on a little bit this voice in Ottawa. When you look at the makeup of Parliament today, there's over 300 MPs sitting in Ottawa. There's only a handful that really have strong agricultural background or understanding. And so these are the decision makers and policy makers. And so any time that your members, that growers themselves can help tell sort of the positive story and the work that they're doing on their farm, that really helps crystallize some of the asks that the groups like ours are making here in Ottawa, because now they're putting a face. There's an actual family there behind that, and there's an actual industry that's trying to move things forward and make things better for their kids and so on. So I think When we work together with Grain Growers of Canada and others on trying to leverage the farmer voice, it's really about giving them an opportunity to tell their story. And things like Real Farm Lives is one initiative that we've done. Advancing Agriculture is one that we're going to be launching shortly with grain growers and others to again, provide a vehicle for growers to help tell their story here in Ottawa. And I think the flip side is that the activist groups have really excelled in this, and they've leveraged their grassroots movements, and they've been able to attack modern agriculture quite successfully. And so we need to be able to counter those voices that don't understand and don't want to understand the benefits of modern farming.
And it's interesting that you would touch on that in terms of the exposure or the experience that our policymakers in Ottawa have with agriculture. I had the opportunity to sit down with Senator Diane Griffin, who's the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, a couple of weeks ago, and she identified the same challenge. Few, if any, senators have a farming background, and very few MPs have a background in agriculture. So there's really an opportunity, I think, as soon as our members can get back into the nation's capital again, to begin having those conversations with policymakers about agriculture. So thanks for identifying that as a key role that we can play. I know it's one our members enjoy playing.
Yeah.
You mentioned the need for regulatory modernization as a key component to owning the podium in 2021. This is a role for government. But for the most part, our farmer members are export dependent. So they're constantly navigating a competitive international landscape. Can you explain what types of reforms you think are needed here in Canada and how our regulatory environment may compare to other jurisdictions? I'm thinking more recently about the decision that was taken in the United States with respect to how they were going to regulate gene-edited plants by comparison to those genetically modified. Can you talk a little bit about what may be required here in Canada and what's happening in other jurisdictions around the world?
Yeah, certainly. Plant breeding is a ever evolving area, and we're on the cusp. We're not more beyond the cusp. We're at a point in time where there are new techniques that can get us to where we want to get in terms of the genetics of various crops much quicker and much cheaper, to be frank, and it opens it up to so many more companies that are able to do this type of work to get the traits that really the farmer and the end customer is looking for. And so companies are investing huge amounts of money in these new techniques like gene editing that you've mentioned. And our Canadian system, while it has served us well, and we've seen tremendous outcomes in GM crops, canola is just one example, we've seen a number of the problem right now is that we're frozen in that there's no predictable path to get these gene-edited crops approved in Canada, and the timelines are not predictable, the pathways are not predictable, and the data requirements are also not unclear. And so we've been working for quite some time now to try to unblock that and get some better clarity to enable those. In the meantime, countries like the US, like you mentioned, have done the same work and have done the same analysis and have said, you know what, this type of approach is not really any different than traditional breeding. And so if you can achieve the end result through traditional breeding using gene editing, well, then we're not going to put a heavy regulatory burden on that innovation. And so, so what you've seen is some clear pronouncements out of the US, and you've seen the investment that followed very quickly. And so we've actually seen Canadian company just outside of Ottawa with its own brand new innovation, wanting to develop it in Canada, wanting it to, the science to be developed in Canada, the innovation in Canada, and then the value added that grows from that all in Canada. They've actually moved that introduction into the US because they couldn't get the predictability they needed in Canada. And so that's the kind of thing that we certainly don't want to see Canada being left behind. In fact, we want to see Canada at the forefront. And because we've like I said earlier, we've been an early adopter of technologies, and it has been very successful for Canadian agriculture, and both in terms of profitability, but also in terms of environmental sustainability and the practices we've been able to implement here in Canada, such as reduced tillage, no-till, have had a significant impact environmentally. So we want to see that continue, and we don't want to see other countries move ahead of us and take those innovations, because at the end of the day, the food that's grown from those crops in the US are going to be imported into Canada, and the only difference is that we're going to have lost out on all of the investment at the front end and all through the processing and value added parts. So we want to make sure that over-regulation or lack of nimbleness in the regulations are not barriers for our members and others. So that's the main thing on the front end. You mentioned trade. The other issue we have is that we've got all these free trade agreements signed with some of the most populous areas in the world, and as a trade-dependent country, that's exactly what we want to see. TPP, as a prime example, is the latest one. But when we sign things like CETA with the European Union, that's great, and on paper it sounded excellent. But before the ink is even dry, you've got Italy sort of stopping durum wheat imports for basically a non-tariff barrier that should be it shouldn't be allowed under CETA. And so what we're saying is that government, it's not enough to just sign these free trade deals, because sometimes the tariffs aren't the biggest barrier. It's actually the non-tariff barriers that are the challenge. And so we want to make sure that they enforce those, and that there's pathways in those trade deals to ensure that countries can't do things like Italy did with durum wheat. That was unacceptable, and we want to make sure that that Canada can really reach its full potential in terms of export markets.
And let's talk a little bit more about the European Union. For several years now, we've seen the European market, driven largely by public perception, move away from science-based policy, evidence-based decision-making. We've seen a movement towards a hazard-based approach, which is essentially employing the precautionary principle, as opposed to a risk-based approach, which is what we here in Canada rely on, and essentially the trading world, for the most part, relies on. In late 2019, the EU released its farm-to-fork strategy as part of the European Green Deal. Most recently, we have seen a proposal from France to begin characterizing crop varieties developed through gene editing as GMOs. So this is taking a different approach than the one taken in the United States, for example. Can you tell us a bit about what's been going on in the European Union and the impacts that this sort of direction is going to have both for European farmers, but also for our export-oriented farmers here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is a bit of a conundrum for sure. If you look at their approach to biotechnology, they decided long ago that genetically modified crops, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, would not be grown in Europe. And so what you saw is the investment companies, even some of the big member companies like BASF, German-based companies, moving all of their biotech investment and innovation and scientists to the US to develop the markets elsewhere, because they knew that there wasn't a pathway in Europe. We also saw farmers just not having access to those tools, and yet having to compete on the global stage. And so the end result is that, again, sticking with grains, you see that the EU livestock industry, poultry and feed, are about 70% dependent on imported grain. And so, they don't grow GMOs in Europe, but they import billions of dollars worth of it to feed to their livestock. And so it's a very disjointed approach to agriculture. And so we're seeing the same thing on pesticides. Their constant attack on technologies and banning of technologies. And you saw it really hit a crescendo with glyphosate, where even the evaluation group, the European Food Safety Authority, said, yeah, there's no safety issue with glyphosate. It should be renewed for 10 years. They reluctantly renewed it for 5 years, and now that's already 2 years ago. And so we're going to be back in the same battle about, should glyphosate be renewed in the European Union in just a short time. So you're right, it's been eroding over a number of years, and their approach is that, they strip the tools from European farmers, and then frankly they use subsidies to kind of help bolster their lack of productivity, and they replace the lost productivity with importation. And so the concern from our perspective is that in this latest farm to fork strategy, there are some positive elements in there, but it's again disjointed. On the one hand, they want to see more self-sufficiency. They want to see a better environmental footprint of agriculture. They want to see addressing agriculture helping to address climate change, and yet it talks about, well, we want to see 50% reduction of pesticides in 10 years. We want to see organic agriculture grow to 25% of acreage. Well, sometimes those two do not mesh. That organic agriculture and climate change, agriculture benefiting climate change, are not synonymous. And so, by producing less on the same land using organic practices, you're not achieving your climate change targets. And removing things like glyphosate would definitely not help their climate change strategy, because now tillage is really your go-to tool for weed control. And so, we would have liked to see sort of the ideology set aside and focus on the actual targets like climate change, sustainability, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, the ideologies are deeply rooted in the EU, and this is a challenge. And so, for an export market, export destination, it's problematic because now you've got talk about removing residue level MRLs, which allow us to export our commodities that are grown using some of these technologies. And you've got a lot of pressure in Europe to say, well, if we can't use those tools here, why would we let other countries export their product to us with those? So this is an ongoing challenge, and it's going to get more acute in the coming years. And we certainly don't want to see Europe dictating agricultural policy for the world and telling all the rest of the world which chemistries they can or cannot use, because we have complete confidence in our regulatory system here in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere.
Thanks, Pierre. So back to Canada for a moment. We talk frequently in this sector about trying to unite the agriculture sector to speak with one common voice. From your perspective, what does this mean, and why is it important if we're going to try and get the attention of this government?
Well, it goes a little bit to the earlier comment about the makeup of the current Canadian Parliament. Especially on the government side, the Liberal side, there are literally a handful of MPs, senators that you would say have enough of an agriculture understanding to really have a deep conversation about it. And so you can imagine all the different sectors in Canadian agriculture with each their own particular set of asks, of issues, so from livestock, poultry to crops, and then even within crops there's a huge diversity of issues and challenges. And so on the receiving end, all they hear is a lot of mixed messages, and it's hard to see a common vein sometimes through all of the different issues, comparing horticulture with grains and oilseeds, with livestock. And so what we see quite often is inaction, because it's too complicated. Agriculture is too complicated to really make meaningful changes to, so they throw a little bit of money here and there, and hope that's sufficient. I think we as an industry need to do a better job collectively on agreeing to at least some high-level messaging and some high-level asks that then on the receiving end they can start to see commonality. So it doesn't matter if it's the livestock sector that's in to meet with them, or grains and oilseeds, or horticulture, or others, that there's a common thread that they start to recognize. Oh, okay, so here's the regulatory reform bucket, and for the grains and oilseed sector, these are the specific examples. Livestock, grain, again, regulatory reform is critical, and here's their particular examples. And so I think there's work to be done with groups like ours, Erin, and others around the table here in Ottawa, to really help make that ask clearer and more concise with the government.
And maybe as a final question, this podcast was developed out of a need to continue the conversation between our farmer members and policymakers during a pandemic period when trips to the nation's capital simply aren't possible. And we're having this conversation also with our industry partners like CropLife. Given that traditional approaches to advocacy and outreach are simply not possible right now, this year I see CropLife took a different approach to your annual Spring Dialogue Days. And I wanted to ask you a bit about a couple of things. One, what it was like to move from those face-to-face meetings that you're accustomed to having every year with your members and policymakers, moving to a virtual platform. And then also what some of the key takeaways were from this year's conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Certainly these virtual meetings don't replace the face-to-face feeling and the outcomes that you get, and the hallway conversations, and frankly, over a glass of beer or wine, you really get to know the industry partners much better. So for us, this was hopefully a one-time thing, or at least an evolution. But we certainly would love to see us get back to face-to-face discussions. We moved our Spring Dialogue Days are typically there's a lobby day component, there's a number of committee meetings, and there's a senior sort of policymaker or industry leader session. And so what we decided to do is we actually moved some of our lobby day meetings to virtual. And so our government affairs team and some of the members actually had Zoom meetings like this with a number of elected officials and staffers. And it actually went pretty well. It doesn't replace the face-to-face contact, but it enabled several of our members at a time to interface with an elected official, have a few questions and get some feedback from them. And it actually, we got very good feedback from that approach. And we're actually going to continue that for the next several weeks and into the summer to have some additional meetings with elected officials and senators. And then for our senior government afternoon, we hosted that, like you said, last week, and it went very well. We had Erin from the Chamber of Commerce. We had Kurt Vossen from Richardson, and Chris Forbes, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, and Q&A and a facilitated session like this, and it went pretty well. Again, some of the feedback we've gotten is that the advantage of doing this virtually is that it enabled a lot more people to participate. We typically get about 140 attendees at our Spring Dialogue Days. We had 349 registered participants in our virtual session. So it certainly opens the door to a much broader audience when you do it this way. So I think, when we look at this, our lessons learned, we'll probably consider a virtual component even as we move back to more face-to-face conversations, just for that element of being able to have a broader reach and to include more people into the conversation.
And that's great. And thanks for inspiring some thought around what we could be doing now as the situation in which we find ourselves continues now for the coming months. Can you tell me a bit about what some of the key takeaways were from the conversations that you were having this year? What were some of the highlights?
Yeah, so we asked Pierre Petelle to really talk about, so they manage, Chamber of Commerce has 200,000 members, and it's really the business voice of Canada. And so we've been working with them quite a bit to insert the agriculture voice and component into that broader discussion. And it's encouraging to see that it doesn't matter really what sector you're in. The resource sector, for example, the parallels to agriculture are very clear. And so it really helped to have the Chamber sort of amplify our ag-specific messages and broaden it and bring much more influential groups, frankly, to the table as well as part of the discussion. And so Erin talked a lot about the need for regulatory modernization and competitiveness. That's their big issue at the Chamber, is the competitiveness of Canadian business. And so it fits very well with what we've been pushing with our partners. And so, yeah, he had some good insights in terms of how do you approach how do you get a whole of government approach. And as a former minister, his guidance is always appreciated. And so we're going to continue to work with the Chamber on trying to really get some momentum with with the government. Kurt Vossen, as a Canadian grain handler and input provider, his perspectives were very interesting, because here's a company that's Canadian rooted that competes globally, and so he touched on a lot of the trade issues, and it starts right here in Canada. So infrastructure and making sure we can get the grain from where it's grown to the ports and then onto ships, and he talked about some of the challenges with that, and then the predictability. He also raised some of the things around Europe, and it's great to have a trade deal on paper, but you need to have the predictability so that when he's sending boatloads of product across the ocean, that he's not suddenly encountering a non-tariff barrier that costs the company a tremendous amount of money. So he talked a lot about that and the regulatory reform that's needed to really enable Canadian agriculture, broadband access, a bunch of things that are near and dear to, I'm sure, your members' hearts as well. And then the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, they've been, to their credit, they've been having very frequent calls with industry that we and several, I'm sure you participated on as well, to keep the sector briefed and to hear from the sector in terms of what the challenges, the immediate challenges were dealing with COVID. And so that's been a positive interaction with Agriculture Canada. I think, personally, we'd like to see Agriculture Canada have a bigger voice when it comes to with Health Canada and other regulatory departments. And I think that's part of that whole Own the Podium or broader initiative, is that it can be driven by one group like AAFC, but they also have to have the pull or the push to really bring those other departments along with them. And so we talked a little bit about that, and he understands the regulatory challenges. Unfortunately, they're not the regulatory department. And so sometimes I think the AFC finds themselves at a bit of a tough spot. But certainly Chris Forbes has been very good at helping the sector and making sure that our voice is carried to the ministerial level and others. So yeah, it was a good session overall. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this. This was a great conversation, Pierre. Nice to see your face again and to connect.
Great to see you too, and hopefully we'll be back in our office building in sometime in the near future. Anyway.
It would be nice. We just moved into our new Grains HQ, which we were very excited about. We've got 6 organizations now, all under one roof. And shortly after we did that, we were all sent home. So.
Yeah, and you guys are just a few floors down from us, and I'd love to come and see your new digs once things get back to normal.
We'll have a housewarming party when we're allowed to do that.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you, Pierre. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the 4th episode of Fireside Chats with Erin. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another special guest. In the meantime, if you want to stay up to date with all things GGC, please follow us on Twitter at Grain Growers or on Instagram at Canada's Grain Growers. Until then.